Well, I
Okay,
got you pulled up on here, so
okay.
you just let me know when to advance forward.
Go ahead. This is me. You heard my colleague, Jamie Matheson, last week, and we had two doctoral students, Matt and CU, working on this. They both got their PhDs now, and one got a job as an assistant professor. They wound up hiring her at Texas A&M, so I guess they like this project. So thank you for inviting me, and we can go to the next slide. Okay, so this figure here just kind of tells the story. It's a little dated, but there have been more recent figures, but they're all consistent. It basically says that the per capita losses are growing tremendously in the U.S., and those in terms of losses from hazards. Yet the hazard severity, at least up until about 2008, when this was completed, had not increased, but it was more due to the losses coming from people building in the development in the hazardous areas, particularly the flood hazard areas are really, if you could see the blue bar going up, it's just going to, so the losses generally overall are growing, and particularly I know for the flood is the worst. So that means controlling the hazard severity staying the same and the frequency roughly the same. It hasn't changed that much between the study periods, although it will with climate change in the future. But it's the per capita losses are going up. That's just because, as well as total losses, that's just because building in dangerous places. They're not listening to the land use planners. Next slide. Okay, so what's the problem? We think a large part of the problem with all this is the fact that there's a poor integration of mitigation and resilience across networks of plans that communities adopt. Communities are adopting lots of plans, even the smallest ones. And a lot of times these plans are mandated. The Hazard Mitigation Plan by FEMA. You have to have a consolidated plan is called from the Department of Housing and Urban Development. You want to have affordable housing funds. You have to have, now in North Carolina, a buyout plan. They're going to require that for local governments to be eligible for buyouts. So there's the transportation. North Carolina, another example is you have to have a comprehensive land use plan for the coastal areas. So even the smallest plans or smallest communities have multiple plans. And what we found in an earlier study that they're all stovepiped. These plans aren't communicating. Next slide. Here's a good example. I want to show you two examples of a classic problem. This is before Hurricane Sandy hit in the New York, New Jersey, Connecticut metropolitan area. This is a town on the New Jersey coast, about 40 miles south of New York City. And on the left side, you're going to see the hazard mitigation plan. You open it up and you'll see the floodplain, the dark blue area there on the left. That, and then if you read the policies in the plan and the proposed actions, they say we want to do buyouts. This is severe repetitive loss location. We want to do buyouts and elevation. And we qualify for FEMA funds because we're severe repeat losses. So you qualify. The same geographic area on the right is covered by the comprehensive plan. But if you look at some of the legends, the purple areas, they're targeted for economic revitalization. The downtown is targeted for like complete streets. They want to make infrastructure investments. They want to put structured parking in. They want to raise the densities. They want to mix the uses and all these things. So what's going on here? Two different things. Next slide. This is the Mississippi, a coastal, a decade after Hurricane Katrina. The Mississippi coast, just like Hurricane Katrina leveled New Orleans, the Mississippi coast was flattened, right? And there are a few communities. It's only about an hour, about 60 miles wide. But this community, if you can see the AE zone, that is the light zone, that's the 100-year floodplain. That's more still water. The dark blue is the velocity zone. It's still the 100-year floodplain, but you have a velocity, like high impact waves. So this community did buyouts, right? And what they did was they bought out for in each of these areas, and you can see the triangles where they were trying to do buyouts and relocation. So the next slide shows the comprehensive plan. There's the current land use on the left, and you'll notice there's a lot of vacant land, right? And this is in the comprehensive plan. And you'll see that a lot of that vacant land was due to buyouts, but also just because it never recovered totally. But look at the future land use. So what they're doing is they want to do low to moderate density. They want to increase the commercial development. So if you look at the green vacant, they say they want to promote development and put housing on it. They're expanding the commercial area. The purple area there on the right, they want to do mixed use high density. They want to make it into a commercial new urbanist type development. So, and they've got all kinds of investment and permitted zoning and these kinds of things that are encouraging this. So it's just like, it's kind of crazy. It's a little helter-skelter. Why we have, going in two different directions after making major federal investment. So those are two examples that kind of intrigued Jamie Masterson and I and my doctoral students. They're like, well, let's look into this a little deeper. How can we come up with a basic idea or method where we could be integrating kind of the scores in the same area or of these different plans? Can we spatially evaluate the coordination of these local networks of plans, and can we drill down at the neighborhood level, downtowns, residential neighborhoods, and so on? And can we actually unpack where there are conflicts or gaps or even consistencies between these plans, among the plans? And also, we wanted to develop a methodology that would allow us to look at, are the plans, these network of plans, are they targeting the most physically vulnerable and socially vulnerable areas in the community? How well are they doing at the neighborhood scale? And how well, and even if they are doing well at a neighborhood scale in some neighborhoods, are they targeting the areas most in need? And we really were interested in physical and social vulnerability. So mainly the method, I think Jamie showed you this the last time, is that we have a policy score for each plan. And basically we code each plan and we spatially identify the score by neighborhood, right? So the comprehensive plan gets a score, the transportation plan, and so on. So this is, and then we integrate the scores together, right? We layer them together across the plans so we can come up with a composite score. So in this case, this is a coastal Carolina community on the, I think not the Albemarle, but the Pamlico Sound. And if you look at the bright red, so we look at the different districts in the community, but basically in different hazard zones. But basically, the hazardous areas, the brighter the red, the more the negative score, and they're promoting economic development. In the blue, they're actually decreasing development, right? They will actually want to.
What slide are you on right now?
Oh, I'm on the layered slide with the layers of plans. Did I not? Number 8.
No. Okay, I got you.
Sorry.
Now.
Okay, sorry. This is kind of, you can see the different plans layered on top of each other. We sum the scores. Basically, it's a +1 if you're decreasing vulnerability. It's a -1 if you're increasing. So the bright red areas are the worst, and the blue areas are the best. And I'll show some examples of how that works in a moment. So this is kind of the sequence of phases that we go through to get the composite score, which is phase 3. Phase 1 is when we engage with the community, we ask them to identify their neighborhoods, their districts. And then we say, well, here are the hazard zones. In this case, on the phase one, we show the 100-year, and then we put sea level rise on top of that 100-year, what it would be in the year 2100. So the dark areas are the 100-year, and then the sea level rise is what's on top of that, right, in this small community. Then we assess the vulnerability. In this case, it's the physical vulnerability. That's the average of improved property, the average value per square foot in each district. So the downtown, right, is the bright red area. And then the blue area, that's the bright red's the most vulnerable, has the most physical, value of investment. And then the blue area is the least vulnerable, the brighter the blue. So then we can look at, if we score the plans, we layer the plans together, we can then see that, hey, look at the downtown, the score. For vulnerability, it's very high. It's in the middle place, that bright red. And then in the middle there, for the score of the plans, it's not bright red, but it's red, pink. They're still promoting development in that area, okay? The good area there is where if you look on phase two, you'll see the light red score, not the dark red, but the light red just to the northeast touching the downtown. You'll see that's blue. And they're trying things there. They combined their parks and recreation plan, land acquisition. They combined a FEMA buyout plan because that area kept flooding. There's a creek in there, and it's a low-income area. So they were able to create a greenway corridor, relocate the development, and get the low-income neighborhood, some of the development outside, move it out. So kind of that was why it scored so well. The downtown was more tax incentive schemes, raising the density, infrastructure investments, complete streets, these kinds of things. So that's how it works. And so what I want to do kind of the remainder of the talk is talk about what we've done the last several years on this project. So there's a research bit, and I want to talk a little bit about that. But as we developed the research, right, as we went through, and we did our publications and our statistical work and all this, and we looked at a bunch of cities, and the 6 in the US, 3 in the Netherlands, and we have 1 in China now, in terms of the research, and we kept trying it and testing it. But as we went along with the research, we were lucky to have somebody that's really good with engagement, and you heard her last week. And Jamie Masterson created, the original author, a local government guidebook out of the research. She says, I can actually translate this research working with you guys and do something about it. I can put some legs on it, make it actionable. So as we went through these years of research, we also developed pilot cases or pilot studies and actually testing and working with the communities for a 6 to 9 month period and applying this approach that I just talked about, the scorecard. And so you can see the sequence there on the chronology of summary of the research activity. Do you have that slide, number 9? Shalene, now I'm going to move to...
Yes, I have it.
Number 10 rather. Now I'm going to move to number 11. Are you okay with 11?
Yes.
I can check with you. Okay,
Sorry,
so you
it
can
takes me a
see...
moment to turn my mute back on.
Okay, so you can see the sequence of you see all the cities we're working in right now. And so that's been fun. Some of them are actually engagement and some of them are research, okay? So what I want to do is just show a couple of graphs on the research. And I want to show the social vulnerability. So basically, I want to show one paper that we did. And these correlations, we looked at 6 cities, and we scored all of each district got a plan evaluation score, and we were looking at what the degree to which vulnerability was being increased or decreased for each district. And then we said, well, let's look at for each city the social vulnerability so we could map it. Just like we mapped the physical vulnerability, you can map the social vulnerability. Basically, where are the low-income neighborhoods? Where can we look at minority and ethnicity So we had a number of variables we could pull together and say, these are the most socially vulnerable, these are the least. What we found was an inverse correlation in 4 of the 5 cities. We couldn't do one of the cities. This is Washington, North Carolina, not DC. But for 4 of the 5 cities, Asbury Park, New Jersey, Boston, Massachusetts, Fort Lauderdale, Florida, and Tampa, Florida, we found an inverse correlation. In other words, all the attention in vulnerability reduction was being the more attention, what this was basically saying, the less attention you got for vulnerability reduction, the greater the social vulnerability. So the lower the plan policy scores, when we stack them together, infrastructure plans, land use plans, housing affordability plans, okay, the lower the score by neighborhood, the higher the social vulnerability. So the poorest, most socially vulnerable neighborhoods were not getting attention, right? Only one city we found attention, and we found in League City, Texas, that they were putting investments in stormwater infrastructure and setbacks and so on in the low-income neighborhoods. You know, doing better improvements on the streets for drainage and so on. They targeted specifically that neighborhood, those neighborhoods. And what does that look like? So here's a map. This is the Sistrunk neighborhood in Florida. Sistrunk neighborhood's a freedom colony. You know, back in the Jim Crow era, after the Emancipation Proclamation, and a little bit later than that, early 1900s, 1890s, African Americans moved to the edge of cities, right? And or the edge of municipal jurisdictions to be away from the pressure from Jim Crow laws. I'm assuming folks know pretty much about that, the Jim Crow. So this is a historic freedom colony that was outside the municipal boundaries and over time has been annexed by the city of Fort Lauderdale. Fort Lauderdale's got a beautiful coast and so on. But you can see the Sistrunk neighborhood, and the arrow is not quite on it, but at least in my version, it shows that it's the most socially vulnerable, and it's a freedom colony. I looked it up, read about it, and so on. But it has a very low score, and basically virtually nothing about vulnerability reduction, any of its plans. What it is, it has an enterprise zone, right? I guess there's a new opportunity zone now. So what they're doing is, this neighborhood is mainly all in the 100-year floodplain. A good chunk of it as well is exposed to sea level rise. Yet they're putting tax credits, low interest loans, tax increment financing, infrastructure investments, all these kinds of investments and market incentives to build up this neighborhood, right? To improve, to get more economic opportunity, better services, and so on, yet very little is being done. So there's kind of a development paradox going on in here where and this is a pattern that's consistent we found across these cities. We only looked at 5 cities we had data on, but 4 of the 5, this is a consistent pattern. And so in this case, it's just making all this investment. So you make all this investment, and then the paradox is when the disaster comes, you lose it, right? So what do we, it just doesn't. I want to show you 2 different neighborhoods now. If you go to the next slide, the pre-Hurricane Harvey Houston, it says Briar Forest. This is more of a quick analysis we did. And we're doing a more serious multi-neighborhood study now. But if you look at Briar Forest before Hurricane Harvey, you can see a couple slides there on the top, the 2 upper ones. It's a upper middle class neighborhood. It's the focus of attention of a variety of plans. So there's a transportation plan. They're getting rapid transit. They're getting interchanges and so on. They're getting, they're focusing transit stops. They're also getting, so that's kind of a negative, encouraging development, but they're getting a policy attention from the transportation plan. But in the positive, the flood control district, there's all kinds of, there's a taxing authority, that creates its own plans, right? And it's the Harris County Flood Control District. They have their own capital improvement plan, and they got all kinds of widening and deepening and straightening the bayou, right? And the community's kind of struggling over that because if you look at the super neighborhood strategy, that's the plan. They are saying, as well as the Gulf Houston Regional Conservation Plan, they want riparian corridors. They're targeting investments. They also want to put forested bayous in. They don't want to treat it like a drainage district. They're worried about Harris County flood control. So they're getting a combination of investments for flood control because they do need some widening and deepening, but maybe they can reforest the buffers and so on. Okay, so this is the Manchester neighborhood. This is along the Houston Ship Channel. And this is kind of this is a highly socially vulnerable neighborhood. And it floods very frequently. There's the regional transportation plan, they're not getting any transit-oriented development. They're not getting any transit lines. They're getting a highway corridor widening that runs adjacent to the neighborhood, but no exits or anything like that. Just going to run and cause more pollution, air pollution, and so on, just more noise. The Harris County Flood Control District, no projects. The Gulf Houston Regional Conservation Plan, repairing corridors for their infrastructure or they have funds, none. They're not doing anything. So this is unlike the Sistrunk neighborhood. This is a forgotten and underserved neighborhood. So there's no investment going in on economic development or flood control. Anything is just Sistrunk's getting some attention, but this place is getting none. This is primarily a Latinx community neighborhood. It's very poor, and the stormwater infrastructure doesn't work. They get ditches there that clog. So that's kind of some of the data. The next slide is the new tool for translating research. I hope I'm doing this right. We're not getting lost. So anyway, that's kind of the research that we do. And I just want to expose you to some of that, how this works. Now I want to kind of focus in on some of the pilot community experiences that we've had. Jamie talked about last week about Rockport, Texas. I'm going to talk about some of the others. But this is a plan integration scorecard, resilience scorecard guidebook. You can look at the website, go into this website, the mitigationguide.org, and then go to the lower left-hand part of the front page, and it'll say scorecard. And you can go in and open it up, and you'll get the guidebook and some other things. We need to update it, but so and basically what we do is when we go into the community, we find willing partners. If they don't want to do it, we won't work with them, and we'll do technical assistance. We'll do training to help them with the scoring, to assessing vulnerabilities, and so on, coming up with ideas to resolve conflicts. If they, but mainly each community has to make an in-kind contribution. We need the lead local planner or local emergency manager or what have you. We need some GIS if they have it available. If they don't, we help them. But most, even the smallest places these days, GIS is out there. They have to participate in the training sessions. They have to self-evaluate their own plans. Some cases, they go to the city council. They seek public input. They might want to make revisions, amend the plans, amend the ordinances, and so on. So I want to talk about a couple cases. But anyway, this is the experience. We've been working in Nashua and Norfolk. We've been working in and also I'll focus on those two. But as Jamie talked about, Rockport, Texas, where they developed a comprehensive plan to guide the recovery after Hurricane Harvey. I'm going to talk about Norfolk and Nashua mainly. And I like the slide on the right here, because Norfolk, they have nuisance flooding, reoccurring flooding when the sky is bright blue, or the moon is out or whatever. It's because they got serious problems with the whole city, much of it with flooding from sea level rise. So I just want to kind of highlight a couple of examples. They evaluated their own plans. they generally came out really high in their score. They looked at their 100-year floodplain. They looked at their future hazards in terms of the sea level rise, and then they scored each neighborhood and each district, and so they came up with some very interesting findings, and what they tried to do. One of them was they found that in the lower income neighborhoods, Norfolk is about 40% African American, as well as many of the neighborhoods are struggling. What they used the scorecard results for was they had success. And if you look at the scorecard that led to them getting some money, it led to them making changes in their plans and so on. But I'll basically say was that this is a resilient, if you've ever heard of the Rockefeller 100 Resilient Cities, the RC 100, Rockefeller Cities 100, RC 100. Norfolk qualified. They got a big investment to come up with a resilience plan, a resilience strategy. They got another investment to hire a chief resilience officer. They have a great urban planning department. But, you know, they went through and they created these plans. They created a new comprehensive plan, had a resilience strategy. And what I don't have in the quote here, as well as they said a great tool that helped us evaluate from the planning director their existing plans and to more fully incorporate their other plans. One was the hazard mitigation plan. The other was the resilience strategy. They never, in creating their comprehensive plan, which has the most teeth, they never read that mitigation plan, and they didn't include the visioning work and all that from the resilience strategy. They didn't think of it. They didn't engage. And so one of the big efforts they tried to do, and I think in these cases like Norfolk, it's not, the score is important, but just as important is the conversation. Because if you have different local government agencies scoring their own plans, and then they discover that the urban planners never talked to the chief resilience officer really in the Vision 2100 and the resilience strategy, never even knew or never even had a talk with the emergency planner who runs the hazard mitigation plan. And so they put it all together and you applying the resilience scorecard and had serious conversations. And what they did find was some of the neighborhoods, particularly the highly socially vulnerable neighborhoods, were scoring low. And so what they did was they had a history of lack of infrastructure investments. That the whole evaluation applying the scorecard revealed this. And so what they did was they went out and said, look, we did this coordinated, integrated effort across the city. And we found that we have a problem with our, there's issues in these, the socially vulnerable. And so they went and they applied for an Ohio Creek watershed initiative where a number of these neighborhoods are. And they looked at not just, there aren't problems, but there are assets in these communities. They did deep dives with engagement. And so what they did was for this Ohio Creek watershed is tried to create some of the recommendations in here to create a healthy, ecologically healthy with a neighborhood that had stormwater retention and mitigation capabilities if they didn't put up hard walls but restored the tidal wetlands and so on. They also have around the development, they tried to connect the developments that were separated by roads, use the park as a connector, and they're trying to do a variety of economic opportunities. They won this is a $112 million grant. They wrote a proposal. They used some of the scorecard results to argue that they needed this investment, and they've done the systematic evaluation. And so they're putting in a resilience park. It's being built as I speak to you. And I think Jamie talked a little bit about the other day, they have this comprehensive resilience strategy, and it requires a lot of coordination. And if you look across the city, you'll see the red areas are high asset, high investment areas. physical assets. I'm not talking about social or cultural assets, but they also have retreat areas in yellow, and they actually want to retreat. They actually have green areas that are they want to target development in, right? And these are higher elevation. These are, I think Jamie talked about this a little bit, but last week. So you have to have integrated planning. If you're going to do a retreat, you have to have infrastructure and zoning and land use coordination, where your affordable housing is going to go, and so on, parks working together. If you're going to create the green areas with new urban areas or higher elevation, how are you going to, there's room for infill, there's opportunities there, and potentially mass transit. So they're going to try to keep the residents in the community. There is worries because the green areas are the low income areas of the city. So we have climate gentrification, right? Or hazard gentrification. So that's a worry. How you resolve that, that's another discussion. Okay, but anyway, I think tough to do. Nashua did an interesting, they had their hazard zone districts. It's the city of Nashua. And I thought this was really cool. These are the 100-year flood, the 500-year. And these are mainly riverine. It's an inland city of about 85,000 in New Hampshire. So they're worried about the increased flooding, and they're worried about the future because they see more flooding coming from the rivers. Because with climate change and the climate warming, you're going to see more, not necessarily more precipitation events, but more severe ones. And they've been experiencing that. And this was cool, I thought. So they did this participatory digital mapping. It's a group called Co-Urbanize. And so as people walked around, they set up these spots where you could kind of take a picture, do a little survey with your phone, take a picture and upload what you see. And then you could comment. They also had a scoring system. So what they basically did, I'm on the participatory digital mapping. Are you okay with that? For downtown Nashua? That's the title of the slide.
Yes, I missed you on a couple of the Norfolk ones, but we're caught back up again.
Okay. Okay. All right. I can repeat if needed, but I'm just not doing it. I'm just not used to it this way. I'm always pushing the button, teaching too long. I'm like controlling it. But here they're doing this participatory mapping. So what they've created is not just the technical knowledge based on the hazard zones and where the vulnerability is, based on data and modeling. They've actually created a narrative, stories inside each of the hazard zone districts about what people want to see in their future in these flood-prone areas. And they did that throughout the city. This is just one little cutout. So I think it takes, this kind of local knowledge, ordinary knowledge, as well as ordinary knowledge, not just being what we're seeing here on the digital mapping, but also the conversations that are had. If you're going to come up with solutions that are tied to place, when you have conflict across these different policy regimes and these different investment regimes, these different plans are promoting, you need to have these conversations, and you need to include the public as much as possible. And this is kind of this whole approach that Nashua is doing. So I just want to briefly kind of summarize. You can see we've tried to map. We stole from public health sort of this logic models where you can actually, I think we need to use these more in planning to track if we're doing an intervention like they do in public health. If we're doing an intervention like applying the Resilience Scorecard, what changes has it caused? And what changes in capacity in the community? So cross-agency coordination, conversations. If you look under the capacity, people, 6 members of the staff got trained on using the scorecard. There was a public hearing. There was an education of the local officials. There was an approval of some changes in the plans. And they created a database were 14 plans that they evaluated, and that database was used to create some outcomes. So I'll just focus on if you look at the changes, they changed the number of their plans. They integrated, they had plan amendments that put the mitigation and the Vision 2100 plan into the comp plan, the comprehensive plan. They prioritized environmental justice. In several of these neighborhoods, they had this new database. So if you look at the actual change in investments and standards and incentives, they got the HUD award for Resilient City Award for the 112 million that I talked about before. They amended their zoning ordinances. They revised their location standards for new infrastructure. Don't put it in the retreat areas, new infrastructure, because they had the capital improvement program that was doing that. And right now they're breaking ground on the Resilience Park, and I want to go up there and see that thing that I just discussed. So the next slide, the same thing with Nashua. They did a very intense in terms of changing their capacity. They came up with a new database with the 14 plans evaluated. I don't know, they had more than that. I think, well, anyway, I don't think that's 14. I think they had more than that. But anyway, they trained 9 members of the core team from the city agencies, the local agencies. But they also targeted climate ambassadors. These are leaders from various stakeholder groups throughout the city. And they participated in, this is how the scorecard works, and this is how, so there were a number of meetings as this went along. So again, you had cross-agency learning. You also empowered, we saw an empowerment of one of the emergency management local government agency, which is usually the small agency stuck to the side that becomes very salient when you get a flood or a fire or a chemical spill or a COVID-19, you know, they rise up. But the director, I'll talk about it later, became empowered and of that organization because of his knowledge he gained just in case from applying the Resilience Scorecard. And also they had the co-urbanized digital mapping. So that helped them as part of the process we went through in terms of eliciting local people's input. So there were definitely changes in the plans across in terms of outcomes. There was, I think, a major change so far we've tracked is that the empowerment of the emergency management organization, the emergency planner, is now sitting on the permit review process. So whenever they review a permit that's in a dangerous area, the emergency manager weighs in the regulatory review process. And in this case, raises issues that maybe the urban planning department may not raise, or the community development department, or the housing, or whatever. So he has a much stronger role than what he had before. So he's actually improving. So anyway, I just want to say that what are the lessons learned? We hear this over and over from the plan evaluators from the city. They say when we look at these different plans, we have a disciplined focus on reducing vulnerability, mitigation, that type of thing. It disciplines us because if we're worried about affordable housing, or if we're worried about transportation, when we're reading the plans, it makes us think through resilience mitigation. And it also forces us to think at the spatial scale, the neighborhood scale. And there you get the heterogeneity. Because if these plans, they change across neighborhoods. And we think, and population groups, and who's getting targeted and who's not in terms of benefits. And also it raises awareness, the conversation again, of the roles and responsibilities across local government agencies. There were 3 big lessons I just learned that. So I think that was one of them. And it's all about, I was saying before, the conversations and the input from people are just as important as the scores. And I think it also helps leverage community champions. We've seen people that take it and run with it, in the case particularly in Norfolk with a grant and an emergency planner with a permit reviewing. And the way Jamie Masterson does it, she kind of makes it fun. If you see her on the lower picture there, They actually do a training and they do a simulating scoring and so on, and make it user friendly. And then when it actually comes time to change the plans or change the ordinances, and they have definite impacts at the very localized level, nudge, don't shove, and work with people. And last slide, I think here on the next steps for the multi-hazard partnership. We've engaged the American Planning Association with support from the Office and the Science and Technology Directorate with funding from them to actually engage the American Planning Association to kind of push this up to the national scale, develop some best practice national standards, the guidebook, develop a tool for training and web platforms for training, get resources so that they have 45,000 members, and they have major delivery resources, multiple ways they can reach the broader audience. Not just the planners, but they also have emergency managers, floodplain people, housing people, and so on. And they want to create a national cadre of trained practitioners. So we're excited about that. Anyway, I've talked a lot. Sorry I got going late. Yeah.
Phil, since you have some experience on the global scale, can you talk? I didn't really hear you mention any of that. Could you mention how it looks the same or different?
Okay. Well, we've just, there's a paper coming out, the Journal of the American Planning Association, by one of the doctoral students. And it's focused on the city of Nijmegen in the Netherlands. And what the Netherlands did was they have 30 cities participating in a program called Room for the River. So instead of, building more dikes, they're really good at that. It's getting too expensive. The sea level rise is getting too much. The inland flooding from climate change and severe precipitation events is getting too much. So they're actually saying we need to do a land use approach. And we're going to relocate part of cities. We're going to widen these rivers, in this case, Room for the River, and we're going to let them go their nature's course where they want to go. And that's going to require, in many instances, relocating whole parts of whole cities, not the scattershot way we do it in this country, where some may get relocated. The people, particularly, that have resources, you have flood insurance, you can qualify for the flood for buyouts at the national level. You can't if you're poor or low income in this country. So it's a scattershot here. In the Netherlands, it's a much more comprehensive approach. They actually have social workers that engage each, as part of the planning in terms of relocating. And they have infill areas in the city where some cases they try to keep the neighborhoods together, but it all depends on what the choices are. So she's applied the scorecard to see, are they doing, when they create these Room for the River, they're creating riparian buffers by nature, because they're letting the river widen. And so a lot of times these riparian areas are natural systems. They're incredibly green buffers they have. So we need, they want to restore those and protect those. They also, with the socially vulnerable neighborhoods and the not so socially and the physical, they're looking at the vulnerability of it. We looked at the vulnerability of the neighborhoods and how well, as these neighborhoods get populated, how well are they reducing vulnerability in them? They may be behind, they may be, they're still subject to flooding, but not as much as before. And in the future, the flooding is going to be more intense as well, and they realize that. But they're trying to get the most vulnerable, most dangerous parts of these cities away from the widened rivers. 30 different cities. So she published an article looking at how well the different plans are operating, because they do have different plans like we do. They tend to be a little more coordinated, though, and they tend to score much higher. What we want to do is more research on how did the people that were relocated fare? And that's a big question that Miyoki Hino and Mind Win and I are asking our students. So we might want to try to put a proposal in looking at the actual impact of what happens to some of these housing. And then we're looking at it in Changsha, China. And there we have a group at Hunan University. They got slowed down. They're right next to Wuhan. But but they've been collecting data, and they're looking for integrating transportation and land use. They're not looking at resilience and hazards so much as they want to say the land use plans aren't well coordinated with the transportation plans, particularly when they put in transit stops. And there, when they put in transit development, they're talking about moving tens of thousands of people per transit stop. So they don't want haphazard development around it. They want denser development. They want it coordinated. But even there, they have trouble at the top down. That's a very top down oriented society. There's turf and siloing going on in the plans, and organizational protection, and kind of like academic politics across departments. So those are kind of two of the other places we're working in. We don't have results for that yet, but paper's coming out this May, the English version. Yeah.
All right, so I want to open it up to the class for questions. If you put it in the chat, I'll say them aloud, or you can unmute yourself one at a time and ask your question.
Can you just go back one slide to the community takeaways? We went through those quickly. Yeah, that one. Thank you.
That one, okay.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Which one is that? Motivating communities or overarching lessons?
Motivating communities.
Okay.
Do you have a specific question on it?
I thought I read something else on there, but no, thank you.
Okay.
Hello, this is Sarah LaPuma. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Can you talk about, because of all of your experience, can you talk about why there wasn't communication and coordination between the plans before? There's so many plans that are made, but they weren't checking plans from the past. Why was that?
Well, I think over time in my career, I've seen more and more siloed type plans. That's kind of a negative term, but standalone, single purpose functional plans cities are adopting. And a lot of that's coming from mandates. If you look at Department of Housing and Urban Development, Department of Transportation, the federal level, FEMA, they all have these mandated plans that even the smallest places have to have, to be eligible mainly for funding. States require plans. Some states, North Carolina for coastal areas, the CAMA, the state of Washington, California. I'm in Texas, no mandates here. No. But communities still have to deal with federal government, and a lot of times they adopt their own plans. Innovative places like Rockport, Texas, that Jamie talked about last week, have their own plans. Then oftentimes I have to do a recovery plan that may be separate. So the cities get overwhelmed, so you tend to focus on what you do, right? And you don't do a rigorous accounting for other efforts. So by the time you get to the implementation phase, you find out all these conflicts, and the momentum, say for a comprehensive plan or whatever plan you're doing, gets lost. And a lot of people get fatigued, and when they run into these conflicts they haven't thought through before they created their plan. There's not only conflicts with stakeholder groups, there are also these embedded plans with their own stakeholder interest groups that support these different agencies, housing to maybe you got parks to, and so you're not really fully vetting, a dialogue. And it just over time, over the generations of planners, these things, the bureaucracies have expanded and kind of taken a life of their own, even in the smallest places. So that's so I think the scorecard, that's why we say the conversation is as important as the scores. In the research, we love the scores, but in the communities, they want the conversation.
Thanks. That's super interesting and something that I haven't been able to understand before.
Yeah. And it has serious implications on low-income communities. And we're working in Houston with community-based organizations that are using this results of this work. Community-based organizations on the east side that represent multiple neighborhoods that are low-income minority versus the west side upper income. And the real differences in who's getting what.
Hi, Phil. This is Katie Kaufman.
Hi, Katie.
How are you?
I'm good.
I just wanted to ask you really quickly how you pick the cities to do these studies in. Do the cities come to you, or do you select them based on like different vulnerabilities?
Well, on the research side, we just picked the ones strategically we wanted to get maximum variability in geography, as well as we wanted them all to be high-risk hazards. We wanted them all to be we wanted variation in capacity. So we tried to get a mix, by no means a representative sample. And we wanted interesting policy issues, like in the Netherlands. In China, it was something to just, so on the research part, it was more thinking through a sampling. But on the engagement side, it's definitely, we have to have a willing partner who sees value in the capability we bring. We just don't want to show up and say, oh, here we have this tool, we're going to apply it. We were a solution looking for a problem. No, it has to be kind of a closely shared. So we have engagement through our history of engagement. We have these connections with community partners. Sometimes it's the local government. Sometimes in the case of Houston, which I gave you a little bit on Houston there in the Manchester neighborhood and Briar Forest, but we have deep, well-developed partnerships in the highly vulnerable, socially vulnerable neighborhoods where we've developed trust over the years. So they see what we're doing, and if they say they want this, we go in and we work with them. But we demand some things of them, but they demand some things of us. Like the data we collect is their data. We involve them all the way, but that they have to commit to what we do.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Hi, Phil. This is Ranger Ruffins, and thank you so much for the presentation. I was curious about the example you brought up on Sistrunk and kind of how you deal with these areas that have had kind of disinvestment, but also have these rich cultural ties to the land, and how we as planners in this field can kind of balance the need to see like economic investment in these areas, but also recognizing that this comes up against all of the issues and challenges that we face with climate change.
And and that's a tough question, but I think particularly working in the low income minority neighborhoods, there's this thing, well, they don't care about the environment. I think there's kind of a narrative that goes around. People like me, I'm an elderly white guy, okay? And I'm tall. So I have all the advantages, and I'm a professor. But I've worked very closely here at Texas A&M with a group of people of color. Jamie's really good at this, been trained at this, and there's a deep caring for the environment and how the environment affects them. And they have a different narrative, right, than other types of communities. So it's trying to figure out ways, given the narrative and the view, their knowledge of their neighborhoods, to make things better. It's not a shove. It's a nudge. If I'm going to if you go to New Bern, North Carolina, I was there a few months ago. They don't want the community center back in the same place. That's an anecdote, but they want, they're worried about the vacancies and people relocating, the loss of services. So they want a community center, they want to improve, but where the community center is located, they know where it's flooding, where it isn't. They're getting some investment from that. And the kinds of, the kinds of solutions that evolve are somewhat different than the dominant narrative that we see coming across, because they're they're unheard voices oftentimes.
Right.
And so in Houston, they care very much about the environment, but they worry about encephalitis.
Mm-hmm.
So it's the smell of the drainage ditch is bad, or the smell, whatever, or the flooding is bad, but the public health worries are really bad.
Mm-hmm.
They want parks, but they don't care about how big they are or how interconnected they are. They want parks where the facilities work in the parks, that the swings aren't rusted out. They want maintenance. They want, there's differences in what even though on the surface there may be things similar. So, and I'm on their radio station tomorrow. In Houston, there's a Charity Productions. It's a community organization, and they're going to ask me tough questions. So you're getting me ready.
And then just a quick follow-up. I guess I'm always curious, like when we talk about resiliency, we talk about building back better. And I think a lot of times that has to do with obviously the physical vulnerability. But I'm really curious if you've seen any opportunities or cities that have taken advantage of building back better socially and kind of, for lack of a better word, like correcting some of the planning issues that made some of these communities have systematic disinvestment and kind of the way they are. And if you see cities or towns kind of actively trying to address those issues while also correcting for the physical vulnerabilities that come with climate change.
Yeah, I've seen one in North Carolina where they actually tried to do a community-based solutions, and there was an acceptance for a buyout, Little Washington, an acceptance for a park put in. Again, I don't think there's enough systematic research on how these households fare after these kinds of, but the ones that are grounded at the bottom-up level, where they're willing partners from the beginning. And we're only planners. We only have, I'm going to really enjoy, or hope is a better word, and hope that I enjoy the results. Jamie Masterson and her group with John Cooper and so on here at the university, Texas A&M, have worked really hard in Rockport. And there was an advantage there because the lead planner, Amanda Torres, she's a Latina, and she reaches into the community. So the results there, the scorecard really made a difference, we think, because they have all this money coming in from these different sources, and there are a lot of these plans coming in, and they try to integrate it and pull it together. And a lot of community interest groups and reach go, not just have the people come to where the planning hearings or the public settings are, and hearings and so on, but go to the neighborhoods, go into the community. So, and that's kind of, it comes out in the plan. So, I'm not saying there's these huge, massive changes, but I think the Resilience Park in Norfolk, they tell me, the planners, that they did serious engagement, but I would like to see how that fares from the perspective of the neighborhood. But I see it's better than it was, I think, than it used to be. But got a long way to go.
Yeah. Thank you.
Hi, Phil. This is Lauren Jensen. Thank you
Hi, Laura.
for speaking to us today. I was just wondering if you could potentially address how the resilience scorecard could be used to address public health issues a bit more. I know Jamie Masterson last week talked about how the resilience scorecard could potentially be used as a plan integration for public health scorecard.
Oh, yeah. Yes.
I was just wondering if you could speak to this a bit more.
And I've been getting this thought because I know so little. but this whole COVID-19, I've seen some, we planners want transit. Don't use transit, for under a pandemic. This is the last pandemic we're going to see? I don't think so. Separate, go semi-rural or something, Don't do all this density we've been arguing for years that supports mass transit, that reduces greenhouse gas emissions, that reduces, if you can get public housing, you don't have to own a car, which can be 30% of your household income can be devoted towards keeping a car, buying it, and keeping it supported. So it's kind of, we're getting a shift, maybe a decline in retail to a more emphasis on after COVID, maybe it subsides. We're going to see people maybe using bars and restaurants and public gathering places more because everybody's buying online more, right? But these other, I miss going to the local coffee shop here, right? I don't miss going, we're buying our food online. We're buying stuff online. But I miss that. And there's people talking about this. I know the Rice Center here, the Kinder Institute at Rice University in Houston, they're worried about this. So what does this mean if we can come up with some guidelines, principles coming out of public health research that would say, well, this is what we need to be doing to create healthier spaces, particularly public spaces. And what does this, mean in terms of movement across the city? What does this mean in terms of how the spatial relationships across different land uses? What does this mean about locating parks? People are exercising, I live in Texas, there's not a lot of walkable streets, as much as with sidewalks and so on and shading.
Right.
What is this? So if we had some basic set of principles coming out of public health, we could say, look at the plans that are being promoted or that are being adopted, say, are they advancing and are they doing in an integrated way, mitigating the public health risks? I'm just thinking COVID, that's like, so are you a public health major?
I'm a dual degree with planning and public
Okay, help me.
Yeah, I think there's definitely room for opportunity here.
Yeah, so that would be a great MP, master's project.
Yeah, thank you.
Take 2 plans, yeah.
Go ahead, Patience.
Sorry, I was muted. I think you might have spoke to this before, but I'm wondering, these are just working off of the plans, right? Not like actually like them implementing the plans. Like, I'm wondering like how them actually actualizing what's in their plans plays into what their real score is. Is that question making sense?
Yes, it does. It makes total sense. And this is kind of one, I'm a planner and I've been looking at plans and I've been worried about implementation, giving legs to plans. So what we've been doing is looking at the plans and then, the logic model I put up, trying to say, well, what's the change in capacity, the different ways that have changed? What are the outcomes? Have they actually changed any of the plans to be better coordinated? What are the standards for land use and public investments as that's actually happened? So we're trying to track over time the pilot cities we work with. I wish we had 10 years of funding, even if it was a little bit, and I'm going to go ask them, where we could keep tracking and seeing if you're improving conversations in the process of making a plan, and you have a database that helps you collaborate to come together, hopefully, not always, or you give voice to something that's not known, particularly to underserved neighborhoods, because of the data and the facts that they were involved, they understand. I think that helps, but I don't think it gets all the way down to what you're asking. And what I would love to see is the planners that work in the community-based organizations or the local government agencies be able to, we need a deeper understanding of how to do implementation. You know, it takes experience. Project management's different than plan making. You know, if you're going to pull off a $112 million watershed project, you know, that involves neighborhoods and impacts them. How do you deal with contractors? Do you have skills for doing workflow and all these things? And anyway, it's a good question. I don't have a strong answer other than it's something I think is very important, and we're trying to do something about it. That's why we did the logic model. Did I answer your question?
All right, thank you. It doesn't appear we have
Yes.
any more questions.
Thank you.
Thank you so
You're
much for
welcome.
joining us, and I'm sorry for the technical difficulties.
And I want to say too to the DCRP students and others, I mean, I taught in that department in New East for 20 years, and I missed it greatly. And I'm back now in a transition year, but I'll be around more next year. And I'll be very active with the Institute for the Environment, and we're looking for students always to get involved in what we're doing.